Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to cover one way to massively increase readability and maintainability of functions in JavaScript. We'll start with an example to illustrate how writing functions in a particular way can negatively impact readability and maintainability. Then we'll apply one simple change for a huge improvement. Let's get into it. For this video, I'm using StackBlitz, and I've chosen the basic JavaScript project. And I've gotten a couple files together already. We've got an index.html file here with a single div element with an ID of container, and a style sheet to add some baseline styles to the document and our container div, and an index.js file for our code. Now this index.js file has a drawBox function, and this function takes a handful of arguments to style and draw a box, and then provides some sensible defaults using the nullish coalescing operator, this double question mark. Now, if you're not familiar with the double question mark nullish coalescing operator, in short, it helps provide sensible defaults when the left-hand side, in this case width, is null or undefined. If you're interested in learning more about it, I'll leave a link in the description down below to another video I did that goes into detail on that operator. Anyway, once the box is styled, we'll append it to the container element. Let's see it in action. Now, because we've provided some defaults, we can invoke the function without any arguments. And we can see that be drawn to the screen over here. And then, of course, if we want to override the defaults, we just pass them in. So we can say, let's do a width of 200, height of 300, top of 200, left 100, and background color white, border red. Cool, okay. Now what if we want to use the default values for width and height and background and border color, but override the top and left values? Well, in that case, we'd have to pass in undefined for the optional arguments preceding those we want to override, like so. So for width and height, since we want to use the overrides, or we want to use the defaults, we'll pass in undefined, and then pass in 500 and 100 for top and left, respectively. Why do we have to explicitly pass undefined for width and height? With positional arguments, where the arguments are separated by commas like so, the position of the argument is what defines its usage. In other words, the top argument, this 500, is tied to the zero-based argument position of 2. So if width is 0, height is 1, top is 2. And we need to provide something for argument positions 0 and 1 to get that top value into position 2. And since we want the default values for those first two arguments, but we still need to take up those argument positions, we have to pass undefined. In other words, we can't omit the first two positions like this and expect the same result. So you'll notice this box got drawn up at the top of the screen, which is totally different than this one that we just drew down here. And this is because the code doesn't know that we intend for 500 to be top and 100 to be left. We have to explicitly tell it that we don't want to pass in width and height. We have to take up those positions. Now we're already starting to see one of the issues with positional arguments, but I want to take this one step further. Let's say this drawBox function is a util in some library. And to illustrate that here, I'll just cut this function out and we'll add a new file, call it utils.js, and we'll export that drawBox function from this file. And we can import it in here like so. Perfect, and we're back where we were. Now, without the function definition in the same place, it's nearly impossible to understand what any of these arguments are doing. They all just look like arbitrary numbers and strings. So if I came and looked at this file, what the heck is 200, what's 300, 200, and 100, and what are these color values? I have no way of knowing without actually looking at the result over here, or the function definition, what these values actually do. Now additionally, what happens if we go and swap the position of top and left? So if I come in here and remove, oops, what happened there? Sorry about that. So we left, and we'll add top back in. Now we can see the result is vastly different than what we had before. So if you ever wanted to reorder or remove any of the arguments, you'd have to go and update potentially every place that drawBox is called. And when you're looking at those invocations here, it's hard to tell that these two arguments in this case, and similarly these two, and this one doesn't count because that was just for demonstration purposes, but it's hard to tell that it's these arguments here that would need to be swapped. So that covers two pretty major and annoying issues when it comes to positional arguments and readability and maintainability of your code. To fix these problems for good, we can actually collapse all of these positional arguments into one options argument. So if I cut these out, and we'll collapse it down into one argument, we'll call it options, and we'll give it a default value of an empty object. And coming down here, using object destructuring, we can wrap those arguments, or those argument names, in object curly braces and pull those off of options. Now, of course, we're still a little bit different than what we originally started with because none of these function calls are adhering to the same signature because we've collapsed it down to one argument here. So we'll need to go and update those. You can't really escape that if you're migrating to this type of approach, but at least with this way, with the options object, it's a one and done update. Once it's converted, you never have to change it again. So let's go through and change these to the right format. So this was width, height, top, left, and I believe this one was BG color and border color. And I'll add that closing bracket. And we've got height, top, left, and closing bracket here. And if we add this one back in, now we can say top, left. And we can see that we're exactly back to where we started. Now just to expand on a few of the huge improvements that we're seeing already. One of them is that we don't need to pass any explicit undefined values like we did before. So in this case with width and height, where previously we needed to pass undefined to use the default values but still take up those argument positions, with this approach we can just remove them. Now the second improvement, which is related to the first one, is that we can now easily add, remove, or even rearrange any of the arguments since they're all just properties on an object now. So if I wanted to swap these, let's say I swap them back, and let me make sure to add a comma there, we see no change. Perfect. And finally, the code is self-documenting. This one's huge. So whether you're looking at the function definition or function invocation, where it's being called, it's totally clear what each value is used for because they're all named. So now I can easily see that this 200 is a width, this 100 is a left, and so on and so forth for the rest of the values. Whereas previously they were all just seemingly arbitrary numbers. I had no idea what they were doing without looking at the result or the function definition. Okay, so there's one more minor improvement that we can make. And before we go there, I want to do one more example here. So coming in here, if I hold Control and press space, notice here that I'm not getting any helpful IntelliSense about the rest of the properties on this options argument. Okay, that's kind of a bummer. So this last improvement will help us out with that. And that is that we can actually inline this destructuring right into the function signature. So if I cut those out and paste those in here, you'll notice that we don't have any change to the result. But now, if we come back and I press Control space, now I get great IntelliSense letting me know which properties I haven't used yet. Now, astute viewers may notice that we're getting an any here, and that's static typing telling me that that property is of any value. If you're familiar with TypeScript, any is not ideal in this case. I'd want this to tell me it's supposed to be a string, but that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. At least this is giving us a massive improvement over where we were before. So I love applying this strategy to simplify functions and make them easier to read and easier to maintain. That said, this video isn't to say you should always use this approach or even use it at all. It's really up to each person or team when a single options object makes more sense than positional arguments, but typically I find about 3 arguments to be the max that I'm comfortable with. If your project has linting, the ESLint max params rule is a great option, and I'll link to that documentation in the description down below. Alright folks, that wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, and consider subscribing to the channel if you're interested in more videos like this. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.